Right, greetings everybody, it is Umber Rays here, ready to start his weekend, but before I get to my weekend, let's give you some nourishment so that all of you can be well fed this weekend. Yes, I know Globalers, you out there, this for you is still a month away, so there's plenty of time for things to change and whatnot, but thankfully, you know, we are going to have a little bit of an extra look today and talk really quickly about some performance before we get into showing off the unit. It's a little bit special today because from my mistake yesterday where I just used Maevia in a test run without even really thinking about it too terribly much, packin did post his video this evening where basically he ran this team that you are seeing right here. The all gunner double ice single light unit, and so I'm just going to publish my findings because I honestly think that it's, at least from this team, I'm not too terribly impressed from it, and I do think Maevia will still be looking to potentially find a better home. I don't think that this is her final spot as to where she will really end up. But yeah, coming back to it, the reason why I'm bringing this up, very strong against the X-Death party that I've talked about previously, X-Death and Shrekken. That isn't too terribly surprising since Maevia shuts that team down incredibly hard. Also just generally good against teams such as Mono Ice, good against a bunch of variety top tier teams, which is actually pretty impressive for a ranged team like this. However, should be noted that it is essentially 3 brand new units in a very short period of time. So one would expect for a team like this to essentially be really, really good. Also, if I just crank up this, I did have higher resolution earlier for when I was looking at that Switch 2 preview, but there is a fair amount of limited and holo VCs here, and just you know, expensive espers. If you talk about it, there's the Irving card, which has been long since out of print. There's also the 10-2 card, which is now I think gone for both versions, or pretty quickly gone for both versions. So this isn't exactly a cheap team to build. It's also not the most expensive team to build out there, but as I said, the performance that I was talking about earlier, where it does do well against some of the really strongest teams in the game right now, it also does incredibly poorly against a bunch of other teams. And interestingly, this team is, from what I saw, absolutely garbage against pure evasion. The Venera Riku combination destroys this team flat out with its design like this. Even with some accuracy boosters, it is one of the worst performers I've seen recently against evasion. So that's not exactly a strong case for this being any kind of meta dominant team that we've seen thus far for Maevia. Now, the other team that it interestingly did really badly against, and maybe it isn't too terribly surprising, but Gilgamesh and AC Sephiroth in combination with a healer also completely killed this entire team off. And I bring all of this data before the demonstration because I think it's actually quite interesting to talk first and foremost about how this gunners and range units are actually performing. Maevia is an incredibly strong unit. She's this, you know, the next in a long line, but so far what packin has put out there is basically half good. It's good against a lot of strong teams and really terrible against a lot of teams that have actually been dropping off. But that might also be kind of good in terms of just meta health, where we have, you know, maybe a triangle or, you know, pyramid, tetrahedral octagon or something like that, where the meta has a little bit of complexity. So maybe a bean here is a really good thing. And I also don't want to undercut how strong I think she actually is. I think she's a really strong unit. And I'm just from my experience with Peachin's video, I don't think that she has necessarily found her best home yet, especially in terms of just like ridiculousness of cost. But here for today and this setting, you can see what we are looking at essentially for stats, and we'll compare that to another physical damage dealer that we have here, Mont. Pretty good for a range-based unit, I think, of this quality. So that's all really good. We're also going to bring Shrek along just because I want to show off a little bit of the DPS that she's capable against a unit like that, who is up until now been consistently very, very strong. It's not the end of the world for Shrek, but it is, as you are about to see, going to potentially be a little bit damage dealy. All right. So getting into it, first off, we will just start doing all of our regular buffs. What we generally do here, although more often than recently, I seem to be just completely missing some of the abilities, but let's take Mont here. Now, we do, of course, have the skills that we've talked about before. If we look at this HP Restoral really quick, 4k HP isn't bad for a, physical damage-based unit that is essentially just healing off of that. So that's pretty good. But looking at this was one of the abilities that I was quite interested in the actual preview of casting it not only on herself, but other units, just like casting that kind of ignore fatal damage ability is quite nice here. Bring Shrek up here. And just because we've boosted Mont does not mean that we are not going to potentially use him here to be a little bit mean. But yeah, we'll get there. Now, as you can see, Shrek, this nice lady's range quite high at this point, with an extra quite a bit to just how far she can go. If we take a look at just casting off this limit burst, not too terribly much for Sephiroth. Damage against some of the other characters isn't that great until you consider, yeah, wait a minute. If we look at what, for instance, Gilgamesh has, Gilgamesh does have an actual barrier here that is being deployed. So we are still getting a fair amount through. Taking a look at some other characters, Mont still can be built to be pretty damage resistant to this character, but Reckon is starting to feel quite a bit of the pain from a early limit burst. And that's not, of course, not the only ability here. This character does have a very high capacity for upping her DPS through different means of her support-based skills with very little cost to her, since she does have such high range. Looking at Frostbite here, 55% on Ashen Mont, 48% on Sephiroth, and 73% against Gilgamesh. We take a look over here. Other abilities as well as hers can deploy as much damage as her limit burst, which goes to show it being quite strong. And as you can see, yeah, we are still have that barrier on there. So if we're not casting barrier destruction, it is a bit problematic. Again, from what I have seen in her early trials with her against other units, is actually very, very capable of wiping out teams quite quickly when she is paired with other range units such as Yuna and Jaden. There is a lot of good synergy there, but it is essentially a bit of a gambit that you are running to basically kill your opponent before they get in close, which isn't, again, anything that interesting. Also, taking a look at her AI, we do know that from initial videos that her AI is programmed just to be a physical attacker, not going to be a healer and supporter when she actually has the choice, which, given her high range, can actually cut her off from casting a lot of potentially other skills that you might want her to cast in favor of just trying to kill the opponent, which may not always work out. your opponent can get in close. Again, Gilgamesh and AC Sephiroth got in close very quickly and were able of dealing a lot of damage very quick. It was essentially over at that point. And something else I noticed from Maevia, we do know that one of her abilities does essentially have a damage bonus as she is kind of further away from the opponents to counter those kind of honeycomb barriers. Her AI still does tend to move generally closer to the opponent if she has the option, so that isn't quite as strong. But taking a look at the other side of the story, if we were to start trying to deal damage against Maevia, a range character, and in general range characters, you don't necessarily always think them as being quite tanky, but take a look here. Not exactly the greatest thing, so let's swap out. We're not also that interested in Ashenmont, so we'll pass there. Or sorry, not Ashenmont. My bad. But let's fire off a few other attacks. Again, taking damage quite well, and her, as we've discussed before, her support skill having 2 HP heals that also generate her haste is incredibly beneficial for her because she essentially gets the heal up, she gets that speed bonus, and then she can keep potentially even lap an opponent if their speed is not necessarily high to keep up with her. But as you can see, firing off a bunch of different attacks, we're still only in about the 3,000 damage range, which isn't necessarily that impressive. So skipping ahead, just so that we can see some other characters, Ashenmont, one of the stronger single target abilities. You can see that her DPS resistance is still quite high against AoE as well as single target abilities provided by Ashenmont. And last but not least, Sephiroth here, potentially being one of the more important checks to a character like this since she is so generally strong. And you can see Sephiroth's limit burst here, one of the more higher damage dealing, but still kind of having a difficulty pushing over that 50% marker for this current setup. The curse status effect here, potentially being at 80%, would be incredibly important for canceling a character like this, since she doesn't have much or really any curse resistance from my memory, which would be really good for shutting down some of her support and healing based abilities. But we'll just fire off some attacks here to deal some damage. Pick up the item, of course. There you can see that reflex counter, also potentially providing a bit of problem here since we are just trying to get this ability to actually activate. There, after Sephiroth has fired off an attack, removing some of her DPS. You can see that is one of the reasons why Sephi was actually really good there, but we're not going to try and kill her just yet. And there is a little bit of the problem. So with the actual use of a character like Sephiroth, you can potentially shut down her survivability more than whatnot, but again, we basically saw that. As for my overall impressions of this character so far, it seems like she is very impressive for a bunch of different reasons. She has really high range. She synergizes incredibly well with the other range characters that have come out so far. I think she also has some good potential flexibility in the future to running with both water, ice, and earth characters. All elements that are just generally pretty strong right now and give her a good potential for surviving into the future. Also, certain vision cards have allowed her to pair very well with other different weapon types, since bow has been popping up on a bunch of different holo vision cards, which is just generally a positive thing for this character. But I've seen the evidence, and the evidence is quite strong. There still is a little bit more to do in terms of the actual discussion of her capability, such as her buff weakening effect, which is something quite new that I don't actually have the full details of how strong it is, because I haven't seen it from Peachin's source yet. I haven't seen it from anybody else's source yet, and that could just be also partially because If you're just running on the friend unit right now, that's really difficult to get exact numbers, given that you can only use the friend unit so many times. So there is still some more things to explore with this character. There is a lot of interesting points with her being added to the game, but we'll have to look at more of that in the near future. So thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and we'll bring you more updates as we find out more. But for me and one stacked grandma, thanks so much for watching. See you later.